of Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305 was stale with cigarette smoke and the low hum of the Boeing 727's engines. It was the afternoon before Thanksgiving, November 24, 1971. The flight, a short hop from Portland, Oregon, to Seattle, Washington, was less than a third full. 37 passengers settled into their seats, lost in their own worlds, businessmen reviewing papers, families readying for the holiday, a college student heading home. Outside the windows, the Pacific Northwest was a canvas of gray, a thick blanket of clouds, and a persistent, chilling drizzle. In seat 18C, near the rear of the aircraft, sat a man in his mid-40s. He was unremarkable, the kind of face that slips from memory the moment you look away. He wore a dark business suit, a crisp white collared shirt, and a black necktie, neatly fastened with a mother-of-pearl tie clip. He had ordered a bourbon and soda, paid with a $20 bill, and insisted the flight attendant keep the change. His name, according to the ticket he'd purchased with cash at the Portland airport counter, was Dan Cooper. Florence Schaffner, a flight attendant with a practiced, professional calm, was moving through the cabin. As she passed his row, the man in the dark suit caught her eye. He held out a folded envelope. Schaffner, assuming it was a businessman's phone number or a lonely traveler's attempt at flirtation, slipped it into her purse without a glance. It was a common occurrence in her line of work. "Miss," the man said, his voice low and steady, not unkind, "you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." The words did not register at first. They were too fantastic, too out of place in the mundane routine of a 30-minute flight. Schaffner paused, a polite smile fixed on her face. But the man's expression was devoid of humor. His gaze was direct, serious. She hesitated, then reached into her purse and retrieved the envelope. Inside, on a piece of paper, was a message written in neat, all-capital letters with a felt-tip pen. The exact wording of that note has never been released to the public. A small, closely guarded secret in a case that would become a national obsession. But its contents were clear and terrifyingly direct. Schaffner's smile vanished. Her blood ran cold. The man gestured discreetly toward the briefcase on his lap. He unlatched it just enough for her to see what was inside. A tangle of red-colored wires, a large battery, and 8 red cylinders. It was, without a doubt, a bomb. Or at least, it was a convincing imitation of one. "I want you to sit down next to me," he said, his voice still unnervingly calm. Florence Schaffner did as she was told. The world outside the small porthole window, the familiar gray sky, the rain-streaked wing remained the same. But inside the cabin, everything had changed. The low drone of the engines was no longer a sound of travel. It was the ticking clock of a nightmare. The man in the dark suit, the quiet passenger in seat 18C, had just taken control of 37 lives, and he was about to become a ghost. The America of 1971 was a nation on edge. The Vietnam War raged overseas, fueling protests and deep divisions at home. The counterculture movement had fractured the post-war consensus. In the skis, however, a certain innocence remained. Airport security was a shadow of what it would become. There were no metal detectors, no baggage screenings, no photo IDs required to purchase a ticket. A passenger could walk from the street to the gate with little more than a cursory check. It was an age of trust, and that trust was about to be exploited in the most spectacular way. Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305 was a workhorse of the sky. The Boeing 727-100 was a trijet, known for its reliability and its unique feature, an aft air stair, a built-in staircase that could be lowered from the tail of the aircraft. This feature made it ideal for smaller airports with limited ground equipment. On this day, it would become an escape hatch. The man who called himself Dan Cooper was a cipher. When he bought his one-way ticket for $20 at the Northwest Orient counter in Portland, he was just another face in the crowd. He was described by the ticket agent and the flight crew as being around 6 feet tall, with a slender build. He appeared to be in his mid-40s, with dark hair, brown eyes, and an olive complexion. He carried only a black attaché case and a brown paper bag. He was polite, even thoughtful. He ordered his bourbon before takeoff, lit a Raleigh filter-tipped cigarette, and settled in for the short journey. When Florence Schaffner sat beside him, her mind reeling from the sight of the wires in his briefcase, Cooper dictated his demands. His voice never wavered. He wanted $200,000 in negotiable American currency. He wanted 4 parachutes, 2 primary back chutes, and 2 reserve chest chutes. And he wanted a fuel truck standing by in Seattle to refuel the plane upon arrival. All of this was to be delivered to the aircraft. He made it clear that if his demands were not met, or if there were any tricks, he would detonate the bomb. Schaffner, her training kicking in, walked the note to the cockpit. She maintained her composure, careful not to alarm the other passengers, who remained blissfully unaware of the drama unfolding in the rear of the plane. In the cockpit, Captain William Scott read the note. His heart hammered against his ribs. This was not a drill. He immediately radioed Seattle-Tacoma Airport's air traffic control. His message was clipped, professional, but laced with an undercurrent of grave urgency. "We are being hijacked," he reported. The message shot up the chain of command. The FBI was alerted. The president of Northwest Orient Airlines, Donald Nyrop, was contacted. Nyrop's instructions to Captain Scott were unequivocal. Cooperate. Give the man what he wants. The lives of the passengers and crew were paramount. As Flight 305 began to circle Puget Sound, a tense, surreal waiting game began. Below them, on the ground, a frantic scramble was underway. FBI agents rushed to assemble the ransom money, collecting unmarked $20 bills from several Seattle area banks. The serial numbers were hastily recorded, a desperate attempt to create a breadcrumb trail. Meanwhile, officials at McCord Air Force Base were tasked with procuring the parachutes. They could only find civilian-grade, manually operated parachutes, not the military-style equipment Cooper seemed to expect. One of the reserve chutes they provided was a training unit, sewn shut for demonstration purposes, a fact no one on the ground realized at the time. Aboard the plane, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken fear. The other flight attendant, Tina Mucklow, became Cooper's primary intermediary. He had her shuttle messages to the cockpit, ensuring she never felt personally threatened. He even tried to pay for his second bourbon and soda, which she refused. When the crew's dinner was served, he insisted they eat. He was described by Mucklow as being calm and intelligent, never cruel or nervous. He seemed familiar with the terrain, at one point looking out the window and remarking, "Looks like Tacoma down there." He knew the aircraft, questioning the flight crew about its fuel capacity and airspeed. He was a man with a plan, a man in complete control. The passengers, for their part, were only told that their arrival in Seattle was delayed due to a minor mechanical difficulty. They read their books and magazines, oblivious to the fact that their lives were being negotiated for thousands of feet in the air. After nearly 2 hours of circling, the word came. The money and the parachutes were ready. At 5:39 p.m., Flight 305 touched down at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. Captain Scott was directed to park the plane on a remote, brightly lit tarmac, far from the main terminals. The cabin lights were dimmed at Cooper's request, a measure to thwart any potential police snipers. The exchange was executed with surgical precision. A single Northwest Orient employee, dressed in civilian clothes, drove a station wagon to the aircraft. He approached the forward cabin door and handed over a heavy knapsack filled with 10,000 $20 bills and the 4 parachutes. Once the items were aboard, Cooper kept his word. He allowed all 36 passengers, along with flight attendant Florence Schaffner, to leave the plane. As they descended the stairs onto the rain-slicked tarmac, relief washing over them. None of them had a clear memory of the man in seat 18C. He was a phantom, already fading from view. Now only 5 people remained on the aircraft: Cooper, Captain Scott, First Officer Bob Radixak, Flight Engineer H.E. Anderson, and Flight Attendant Tina Mucklow. With the ransom secured, Cooper laid out the second phase of his plan. He instructed the pilots to fly to Mexico City. The flight path was to be precise. They were to head south on Victor 23 Airway, the main route to Reno, Nevada. The plane was to fly at the lowest possible altitude, 10,000 feet, with the landing gear down, and the wing flaps at 15 degrees. This configuration would keep the aircraft's speed at a sluggish 100 knots, roughly 115 miles per hour. It was an unusual, aerodynamically awkward request, but Cooper was insistent. And then came the most baffling instruction of all. He wanted the aft air stair to be lowered and left down for the entire flight. The flight crew protested immediately. It was dangerous. It was unheard of. Flying with the aft stairs down was simply not done. Cooper was adamant. No, he said simply. The message was clear. It was not a negotiation. Before takeoff, a dispute arose in the cockpit. The flight crew argued that the plane's range was insufficient to reach Mexico City without refueling again. Cooper, ever the pragmatist, agreed to a refueling stop in Reno. At approximately 7:40 p.m., after 2 hours on the ground, the Boeing 727 once again roared to life. It taxied down the runway and lifted off into the dark, stormy night. The Ghost was back in the air. The flight to Reno was unlike any other. The cabin remained unpressurized due to the low altitude. Tina Mucklow, who had been instructed by Cooper to join the rest of the crew in the cockpit, was the last person to see him. He was using cord to tie the money bag shut. He was calm, methodical. He told her to go to the cockpit and close the curtain. He did not want to be disturbed. Somewhere over the vast, rugged wilderness of southwestern Washington, under the cover of a raging thunderstorm, D.B. Cooper made his move. The pilots noticed a change in air pressure in the cockpit, indicating that a door had been opened. A moment later, at approximately 8:13 p.m., the aircraft's tail section experienced a sudden upward movement, a small but distinct bump. The crew tried to speak to Cooper over the intercom. There was no answer. The man in the dark suit, with a knapsack full of $200,000 strapped to his body, had walked to the rear of the plane, lowered the aft staircase into the freezing 115-mile-per-hour wind, and stepped out into the black abyss. He disappeared into the heart of the storm, somewhere between Seattle and Reno, at an altitude of 10,000 feet, over a landscape of dense forests, jagged peaks, and churning rivers. The plane landed safely in Reno just after 10:15 p.m. It was immediately surrounded by a swarm of law enforcement and FBI agents. They stormed the aircraft, weapons drawn, expecting a confrontation. They found nothing. The cabin was empty. On seat 18C, Cooper had left behind his black clip-on tie and the mother-of-pearl tie clip. In the ashtray were 8 Raleigh cigarette butts. Of the man himself, there was no trace. It was as if he had simply dissolved into the night. The investigation into the hijacking, codenamed NORJAK, Northwest Hijacking, by the FBI, began immediately and became one of the most extensive and expensive manhunts in U.S. history. The primary challenge was the staggering uncertainty of the jump zone. The 20-minute window during which Cooper could have leaped from the plane created a search area hundreds of square miles in size, spanning some of the most treacherous and inaccessible terrain in North America. The very next morning, a massive search effort was launched. Army soldiers, Air Force personnel, National Guardsmen, and civilian volunteers scoured the dense forests and mountains of Clark and Cowlitz counties in Washington. Helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft flew low over the canopy, their crews scanning for any sign of a parachute, a body, or a bundle of money. The search was a grueling, frustrating exercise in futility. The terrain was a labyrinth of deep ravines, thick undergrowth, and towering Douglas firs. The weather was brutal, with heavy rain turning the ground to mud and fog obscuring visibility. For 18 days they searched. They found nothing. No parachute, no briefcase, no body, no money. The FBI's investigation branched out in thousands of different directions. The few pieces of physical evidence Cooper left behind were scrutinized with painstaking detail. The cigarette butts were analyzed for DNA, but the technology of the era yielded no conclusive results. The clip-on tie became a focal point. Decades later, in the 21st century, citizen scientists, using electron microscopes, would discover particles of pure, unalloyed titanium on the tie. This was a rare material in 1971, used primarily in the aerospace industry, suggesting Cooper may have been a manager or engineer at a plant like Boeing, which had a major presence in Seattle. But it was a clue that led nowhere definitive. Agents chased down more than 1,000 potential suspects. They interviewed ex-paratroopers, disgruntled airline employees, and known criminals. Every lead was pursued, no matter how thin. The composite sketch of Cooper, based on the recollections of the flight attendants, became one of the most famous wanted posters in the country. It showed a man with dark, horn-rimmed sunglasses, which he had worn during the flight, a determined jaw, and an air of quiet confidence. It was the face of a ghost, a face that could be anyone and no one. For nearly a decade, the case grew cold. The legend of D.B. Cooper, a name born from a journalistic error, an early reporter confused Dan Cooper with a local man named D.B. Cooper, who was questioned and cleared, grew into a modern American folk tale. He was the working-class anti-hero, the man who beat the system and got away with it. Songs were written about him. Bars held annual Cooper-themed festivals. He represented a fantasy of escape, of sticking it to the man and vanishing without a trace. Then, in February 1980, came the first and only concrete break in the case. An 8-year-old boy named Brian Ingram was vacationing with his family along the Columbia River at a place called Tina Bar. While digging in the sand to build a campfire, his fingers brushed against something brittle. He pulled out 3 rotting bundles of cash. The rubber bands holding them together had disintegrated, but the bills were still stacked. They were waterlogged and decayed, but identifiable. When his family took them to the authorities, the FBI confirmed the unbelievable. The serial numbers matched the ransom money given to D.B. Cooper. The discovery of $5,800 of the ransom money ignited a firestorm of new theories and reignited the investigation. But the find created more questions than answers. Tina Bar was miles from the most likely jump zones. How did the money get there? The bundles were still in stacks, suggesting they had not been scattered by the fall. FBI hydrologists studied the river's currents, trying to determine if the money could have washed downstream from a location within the flight path. The results were inconclusive. Some investigators theorized that Cooper might have buried the money, intending to come back for it later. Others wondered if he had lost a portion of it during the jump. The discovery proved that Cooper's flight had ended, but it offered no clues as to whether he had survived it. Over the years, a handful of compelling suspects emerged from the vast sea of possibilities. One was Richard McCoy Jr., a Vietnam veteran and skydiving enthusiast who staged a near-identical hijacking just 5 months after Cooper. He successfully parachuted from a Boeing 727 with $500,000 in ransom money, but was caught 2 days later. He claimed he was innocent of the Cooper hijacking, but the similarities were striking. McCoy was killed in a shootout with the FBI after escaping from prison in 1974. Another was Sheridan Peterson, a former Marine and smoke jumper who had worked for Boeing in Seattle. He was a skilled outdoorsman and an experienced parachutist. He bore a physical resemblance to the composite sketch and was known for his eccentric, risk-taking personality. When questioned by the FBI, he was evasive but never charged. More recently, a man named Robert Rackstraw, another Vietnam veteran with extensive parachute and explosives training, became a person of interest. He was investigated in the late 1970s and repeatedly denied any involvement until his death in 2019. Despite a team of private investigators and a popular documentary making a strong circumstantial case against him, the FBI maintained there was no direct evidence linking him to the crime. The Bureau itself remains divided. Many agents who worked the case believe Cooper could not have survived the jump. He leaped into a freezing, high-velocity wind at night during a storm into a treacherous wilderness. He was wearing a business suit and loafers, not proper gear for a high-altitude jump. The parachutes he was given were not steerable, and one was a dummy. The odds of him landing safely, uninjured, and then hiking out of the dense forest were, in their view, infinitesimally small. He was likely, they concluded, buried in an unmarked grave somewhere in the Washington woods. But others are not so sure. They point to Cooper's calm demeanor, his apparent knowledge of the aircraft and the local terrain. He was no amateur. He was a man with a plan, and that plan may have included a rendezvous with an accomplice on the ground. The discovery of the money at Tina Bar, far from the presumed drop zone, could suggest he survived and deliberately left or lost a portion of the cash. In July 2016, 45 years after Flight 305 was hijacked, the FBI officially announced it was closing the active investigation into the D.B. Cooper case. The NORJAK files, containing 66 volumes of evidence, interviews, and dead ends, would be preserved for historical purposes. But no more resources would be dedicated to solving the mystery. The ghost was being allowed to rest. The legacy of the hijacking, however, is permanent. Cooper's crime was a watershed moment for the airline industry. In its wake, airport security was transformed. Cockpit doors were reinforced. Metal detectors became standard at every airport. passenger screening became a universal requirement. The era of casual, trusting air travel was over, brought to an end by one man with a briefcase and a note. But the true legacy of D.B. Cooper is not in the security measures he inspired, but in the story he left behind. He is the ultimate unknown, a blank slate onto which a nation has projected its fantasies and fears. Was he a brilliant criminal mastermind or a desperate man who got lucky? A disgruntled veteran or a common crook? A hero who beat the system or a fool who plunged to his death in a lonely forest? The lack of an answer is what gives the story its power. It is a perfect mystery, a narrative with a beginning and a middle, but no end. The crime was audacious, the escape cinematic, the disappearance absolute. D.B. Cooper didn't just hijack a plane, he hijacked the American imagination. He pulled off the impossible, not just by commandeering a jetliner with a quiet threat, but by vanishing so completely from the modern world, a world that is increasingly mapped, monitored, and recorded. He remains the only unsolved case of air piracy in the history of American aviation. The $194,200 is still missing. The parachutes were never found. The man in the dark suit, who paid for his ticket in cash and ordered a bourbon and soda, stepped out of a Boeing 727 and into legend. He is a ghost in the machine, a question mark hanging in the cold, rainy skies of the Pacific Northwest. He is a campfire story, a cautionary tale, and a testament to the enduring allure of a man who simply flew away. And somewhere out there, perhaps buried deep in the earth or scattered by the winds, lies the answer to the question that has haunted investigators and armchair detectives for half a century. Who was D.B. Cooper? The trail for this case ends here, but the questions remain. If you have a theory, leave it in the comments. To join the investigation on our next unsolved mystery, subscribe to No Trace.